This episode of The Agronomist is brought to you by RealAg Radio, CanolaMaster, and ADAMA Canada. While other sources of innovation run dry and fail to understand your needs, ADAMA is here to deliver. And we're all in on you. Talk to your ADAMA sales rep today. Hello and welcome everyone to The Agronomists. I am your host, Lindsay Smith, and this is, well, as you can tell by the intro music, this is our holiday edition, we're going to call it, and it is the last of 2022. We are going to take a break next week from the show, and wow, I can't imagine a better way to wrap this up than what we're going to do tonight. We're going to talk about the top 5-ish agronomic challenges or opportunities, depending on how you look at it, of 2022. But before I bring in my guests, of course, just want to remind everyone, if you collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist tomorrow morning. Let us know you took in the broadcast and we'll get those credits for you. And while you're there, if you don't already get the Agronomists email, you can scroll down the page, sign up for the email. That email list just reminds you of when the show is going to air, sends you a link, and reminds you to sign up for your CEU credits. So if that is something you don't want to miss, then please do that. Welcome, everyone in the comments already watching, of course, across Canada and maybe even the US. I do love that we've started with, how cold is it where you are? We know the West is rather chilly, so we're going to dive right in. Tonight's guests, of course, here we go. We've got Jeremy Boychyn with Alberta Wheat and Barley Commissions, Deb Campbell with Agronomy Advantage, and Jason Voogt with Field of Field Agronomy. Jason out of Manitoba, Deb out of here in Ontario. Thank you, Jason. Merry Christmas to you as well.
It's not Jason, it's his avatar, Frosty.
It's Frosty. Yes. Okay. So I do want to start. We are going to talk the top 5, but I do want to start with a quick around the horn of what the weather is like where everyone is, because as I understand it, the West is in a deep freeze or about to be. So Jason, I'll start with you out in Manitoba. How cold is it?
It's cold enough.
Okay.
So we're talking like minus 20, minus 22. So not terrible. It's going to get colder in the next few days, but we had about a foot of snow last week. And so, as usual, we get the snow and then it's followed by some cold weather. So a little bit of extra snow today, but otherwise, yeah, looks like it's going to be pretty cold through the holidays.
All right. Looking at some of the comments coming in, Jeremy in Alberta, how many sweaters are you wearing around the house?
Yeah, I was just looking at my weather app. It tells me it feels like minus 44 right now where I am. So
Right.
a little chilly, but I haven't looked at the forecast moving forward, but I think it's supposed to warm up for Christmas and get into minus 5, minus 6. So I'll take a few days of minus 44. I'll turn the fireplace on and read some agronomy stuff, I think.
There you go. Now, Deb, I see from your face that you desperately want to move to Western Canada. But
No.
how are things where you are in the Highlands?
We're a balmy minus 4. None of this minus 44 nonsense. And yeah, we've had everything in the last 5 days. We've had rain, freezing rain, snow, but everything's nicely white, ready for Christmas.
Yeah,
Yep.
Absolutely. Now, I feel bad. Kevin, known as Canadian Cowman here, is out in the Fraser Valley, and he's saying it's minus 13, which puts them in survival mode because they are not designed for that. Their buildings are not, and I don't think that people are acclimatized to it either. I'm sorry, Kevin. You're going to have to wear a lot of woolly socks. Okay, so weather is where we want to start in trying to, in an hour, encapsulate the challenges of 2022. I'm going to try and use an outline, and we're going to start with weather. So, Deb, I will start with you. What would you say for Ontario and your area was the biggest weather story for 2022?
Actually, for most of Ontario, we were in a just enough scenario, I think. There were certainly a couple of droughty pockets, and it's unfortunate for the producers in those zones because they had a hard season. But probably about 80% of the province had good enough rainfall, just enough rainfall, adequate rainfall, and moderate temperatures, which really led to some pretty good results. So obviously a mixed bag. Ontario is a big place, but overall, I'd say it was a positive year weather-wise.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jeremy, I think you even have some maps. But again, we are dealing with we are dealing with big geographies. But what do you think is the biggest weather story for Alberta for 2022?
Yeah, interestingly, it aligns with Deb. I feel like we were just in time with rain. We came out of a massive drought from 2021, and literally every drop this year counted. We were bone dry until the end of May, and then the taps opened, and thankfully they did, because Jay, if you throw up I think it's the rainfall or subsoil moisture for April 20th, across Alberta, we're pretty bone dry, and it caused a lot of issues and with decision making and challenges, and what kind of yield am I supposed to expect with this, and are we going to even get any rain? So things were looking pretty ugly. The Peace was looking a little bit better, but they ended up actually getting quite a bit more rain than the rest of the province early in the season. But that was the biggest thing this year. And then June, the taps turned on, and in some places they got 6 or 7 inches in a matter of hours, which took a lot of soil away and caused some issues of its own. But that really saved us here in Alberta, and I think Saskatchewan as well.
So hang on, Jeremy, if I'm reading this correctly, because my eyes maybe aren't as great as they could be, that pink area, that's the driest does that say 30 years or the frequency? It's the very driest, which there's
there is
actually some
areas. Yeah, that it would be driest in 50 years, so it's a 50-year drought in those areas.
Wow.
Yeah, and then I put up a picture of some tracks that had gone through, and this was mid-June, and this is an area that was in that 50-year drought time, and just how quickly it kind of turned around for this was near Olds, Alberta, about 20 minutes east of there, and turned around quite quickly. So some areas went from bone dry to sopping wet, but it was also those areas that didn't receive as much rain in June, because like Ontario, Alberta's quite big, and some of the areas didn't get much of that rain, and with a lack of subsoil moisture coming out of 2021, those areas were much more challenged in terms of attaining yield and reaching.
Yeah. Now, speaking of whiplash for changing things, we go to Manitoba. And that's right. What's the top? Can you pick one top story, or is it one per month for Manitoba? How did it shake out, Jason?
It almost is. We went from drought, literally, to excessive moisture causing a lot of crop damage. And I think the biggest story would have been in spring. We had probably 4 Colorado lows, and like exactly 4 weekends in a row that dumped a lot of extra snow and rain on us. And then it was a slow melt, so we had very delayed seeding. And as I had mentioned or had sent in that PowerPoint, we had what turned into about 3 to 4 different seeding periods once it did allow us to seed. But in between that, we had just a lot of excessive moisture. But as crazy as that is to hear, end of the day, we had some amazing amazing yields for certain crops.
Okay, and so that's where I want to go with my follow-up to this, because Deb, we had a wheat crop that did not go in well in the end of 2021. It went in some pretty rough conditions, and I'm being kind, maybe. But turned out quite well for 2022. So what all came together to result in actually really good wheat yields?
Exactly. We had the most miserable looking winter wheat crop this time last year going into winter, and tile run wheat, killed out areas in wheat. Some folks even tried to replant into those poor areas in November, kind of a Hail Mary attempt to patch them in a little bit. And we had a very moderate winter, mild temperatures. I'm in the snow belt, so we had snow cover most of the winter, but, um, you know, very moderate winter, and then, a nice spring. April was uh, April was about perfect for recovering wheat. So not too wet, not too dry. And turned by the end of April, things had filled in. Those thinner, stressed areas had filled in and resumed growing. And by the 5th of May, you'd think it was the best crop ever seeded. And the recovery on that wheat was incredible. And I don't think any of us would have forecasted that ever.
No.
So,
No.
some very good stress tolerance there. And and it didn't look back from that point on. We it filled in, picked up, and got growing. We had just enough rainfall. Some areas through that grain fill period were just maybe a little on the dry side, but adequate, I guess you'd call it. And some of the best results we've ever seen on winter wheat in Ontario. So where it came from and how it pulled that off is anybody's guess, but we got lucky, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of things aligned. And Ray
Yeah.
DeBanco out in Calgary says, Peter would say there's no such thing as miserable wheat. I think even Peter would say that this year the wheat looked
It was
miserable.
miserable.
So that's,
Yeah.
it was miserable. So that's not true. So yes. Okay. Now, Jason, as you mentioned, there were sort of 3 seeding windows for Manitoba because of how late the snow came, how late the water receded over much of the province. And it caused some issues for some crops, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But the soybean yields set a new provincial record.
Yep.
So when did the soybeans go in? The first, second, or third seeding window?
Well, in most cases, they actually went in that second and third window. We've really been trying to move our growers to seed their soybeans before their canola. And mainly because of the fact that we just have such a hard time getting canola to emerge evenly, and dealing with the flea beetles. If we can delay it somewhat, but at the same time not compromise yield by having them flower in the hottest part of the year, we've been able to push them back and then seed soybeans first, because a lot of the data, especially from Ontario, is showing that soybeans can really tolerate a lot of the cooler soils and cooler temperatures early on, and when we saw that. So it would have been that second or third seeding window, but what really was amazing was the crusting that we had and how well they pushed through that crust. And then we got the rains in late July, early August that we needed to really fill those pods. And if Jay could pull that up, we could pull up that photo under the record soybean crop, and it shows the that pod cluster on the top of the soybean. And we saw this, and this is just one example, but we saw a lot of this in our soybeans this year. And not just this, but also a lot more nodes, and more nodes means more pods per node. And so a lot of that happened, and those top pods filled. And if you can look at that and zoom in on those 4 bean pods.
Yeah, I'm trying to count them. Did you count some of these? How many are there? There's a lot.
It's just ridiculous. Yeah. And it does vary within the south central part of the province that we work in too. That Elm Creek area, there was a 3-week period or 3-week period there where we had 3.5 inches, then the following week an inch, and the following week after that another 3 inches. Further south, they didn't quite get as much. And so that's where, we're seeing some of these 60, hot mid 50s to 60 plus bushel soybean yields.
Mm-hmm. Not bad even by Ontario standards, Deb.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking.
Right. Yeah. Now, so then, Jason, my question is how, if I'm going to, in Manitoba next year, plant my soybeans, how do I get them to do this then? I would like them to all put their pods way up there, all 4 beans and lots of them. Can we plan for this next year?
Yeah, the only thing that we can do really to plan, and this is a lot of really good information that's come from the Manitoba Pulse growers, also from our colleagues in North Dakota, Ontario, even from certain soybean breeders like Syngenta and DeKalb, where that earlier planting, getting them out of the ground early, and because they're a photosensitive crop, we want them to be putting on as much vegetative growth during those longest days of the year. And so by doing that, we get these plants to get out more pods, more nodes. What we had in some cases was there was a lot of internode space, but we want more nodes per plant. And that happens by getting them in early and getting them to grow during that longest days of the year. So in that, late June kind of period, that sets them up really well for establishing higher yield. And after that, it really comes back to heat and the moisture at that right time.
Yeah, unbelievable. And it's certainly, when you look at pictures of what spring looked like, not what I anticipated seeing by fall. Brendan does note, now Brendan's up near, I believe near Arborg, correct me if I'm wrong, Brendan, but he says there was a third window, there was 2, and then the deadline hit. So that is an issue. So yeah, that definitely, there are crop
Yep.
insurance deadlines we have to think about,
Yep.
for sure. Yeah. Okay. So just quickly, do you remember the date-ish of this photo that's on the screen right now, Jason?
Oh boy, that would have been in that. I think that third window. We would have just got out of, or just barely got back into seeding after like another 3-inch rain, and these guys were trying to finish off getting some cereals in, and then moving into canola. And again, I mean, this is a good example of what did happen for most growers. This in particular, though, was a case where he got a little too close to a shelter belt where there had been 20-foot drifts, and
Right.
still would have been quite wet. So, but I mean, that's not uncommon with what we saw this year. I mean, we did have areas that we had to leave because they
Yeah.
were just too wet.
I will, hats off to the tracks, though. That's pretty remarkable that it's not sunk further than it is. But that
Exactly.
it does make me cry a little bit. Okay, so before we move on from the weather completely, Jeremy, when I think of Alberta this year, I think of the Big White Combine coming through, some pretty significant hail events. We had some pretty large wipeouts of some crops. So how big of an impact did those storms have really overall? Because they did come at just a horrible time of year. There was no chance of recovery. So how big of an impact did the hail have?
Yeah, so there was the massive one that went through Medicine Hat area and then Innisfil, and if I remember correctly, there was one further up north, and it's evading my memory right now of where exactly that was, but that came in the, oh goodness, the wheat was heading
Yeah.
in Innisfil when that came through, and I don't think the timeline in the Medicine Hat was storm was too much further ahead of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, pretty impactful, right? Like we're not able to. We could put out secondary tillers and tertiary tillers that come from that, but they're not going to have the yield potential. So I know producers that kind of waited and saw what they could get out of it, and in some cases, I think they were a little bit more surprised, but in some of the heavier hit areas, there was nothing left for real recovery. It was pretty flat. There was some farmers in the Innisfil area that are still making recovery on some of their farmyard and equipment and replacing bins. It was pretty ugly. So yeah, the impact, as with most hailstorms, is going to be variable depending how close you are to that center track of where it tracks through. And, it varied from everything to losing, 40, 50, 60% to a complete wipeout. So yeah, varying challenges, and it's always unfortunate when those come through. So yeah, tough, especially when it hits the farmyards too.
Absolutely. And certainly, I mean, weather is the one thing we cannot control. We can just adapt to it. But when hail comes through, especially that late, there's really nothing you can do. I will say, and she probably wouldn't mind me sharing, but my colleague Kara Oosterhouse was one of those farmers whose farms got essentially annihilated in one of those storms, and they made the best of it, and she actually went on holidays for a week in September, which would never normally happen because there's always a crop to harvest. So lemonade out of lemons there. So there you go. All right, we are going to hear a quick thank you to our sponsors, and then we're going to shift gears into our next topic of the night. Our sponsors tonight are ADAMA Canada, RealAg Radio, and CanolaMaster. We call ourselves CanolaMaster because we want every canola grower to achieve growing perfection. Master your canola with the 160 Acres of Gold giveaway. Enter today at canolamaster.ca. Conditions apply. All right. I love these little recorded ones. This is so much fun. Don't love hearing my own voice, but you know what? I'm getting used to it. Okay, let's switch gears. I think we're going to move to weeds and insects. So maybe a bit of a different order than I warned all of you, but it's my show. I can do what I want. So we're going to start with Jeremy. I'm going to start with you. Let's talk grasshoppers. When I think grasshoppers, I think super dry conditions, and I think like locusts coming in and leveling everything. So I know that's not reality, but that's what I think of. So how did the year shape up for grasshoppers?
Yeah, I think I actually provided a little bit of a map of what the forecast was for grasshoppers in Alberta, and I know Saskatchewan had their a pretty aggressive forecast as well. So you can see in the north there, which is the species Bruneri, typically where we see that 2-year rotation of that species of grasshopper causing impacts, and then the south, and this is really a factor of populations growing and big wide open falls where they can continue to feed and put out more eggs. And then the next year, it's just the populations are enormous. And you can see early in the spring, well, not early in the spring, early in the summer, you can see those young grasshoppers in the population in the ditches just continuing to grow. In terms of southern Alberta, there was a pretty continuous impact in feeding on grasshoppers, especially as we got towards the end of the season. There was a few calls that I had received on making the decision of spraying or not, because it was so close to the end of the year and there wasn't as much green material left. Is it feeding on the heads? If it is feeding on the heads, are we in that pre-harvest interval window? So the pressure of grasshoppers kind of pushed through the entire year with their presence being there early, which is, this is where it's important for producers to make sure that they're out scouting for these throughout the season, not just waiting for, when we start to see them hopping around and they're large, because they're easy to control when they're younger, earlier in the summer, before they get to large sizes. So, managing that issue earlier on. The problem with that then is if your neighbors aren't controlling or there's more coming out of the ditch, there's always more grasshoppers that continue to move in, and there's more need for control. So it seemed like it was a perpetual issue this year, some areas more than others. Relatively impactful to those producers in southern Alberta.
Absolutely. Now, when does this forecast come out for 2023? Like February-ish, or when do you usually see it?
Yeah, so I believe it comes out at the end of January, after Shelley has collected and run through all of her information. So we should be able to get an idea of what that looks like for 2023. considering the late summer and fall that we had, I imagine we'll be looking at something similar. I hope I'm surprised, Lindsay. I really hope I am. But again, we had that dry, open fall, which means a lot more eggs laid, a lot more feeding, and a lot more possible grasshoppers in 2023. So it's certainly something that is going to continue to be an issue. And while I'm hitting on it in southern Alberta, it's kind of the same conditions that are causing more issues with wheat stem sawfly and smaller pockets that we're seeing it, but those big open falls are really allowing an extra generation to come in and continue to cause issues on hollow stem varieties in those pockets. So they're kind of getting in those areas double whammied with the grasshoppers and wheat stem sawfly.
Yeah. Okay. And we actually, Jeremy, you were on, I think it was the last time you were on this show. We did talk quite a bit about wheat stem sawfly. And I will try and find what episode that was if anybody wants to go back and listen, because some fascinating discussions there on how to manage for that particular pest. But yes.
So
all
I
right.
have a question,
yes.
Jeremy. Hey, we don't have maps like that for Ontario. They don't put those out. How accurate are they? So you get a risk map at the end of January, and like, how real are they, or what do you do with them?
So the most important thing for producers to realize is that it needs to be ground proof, right? We have Alberta Ag employees that, specifically Shelley Barkley, who manages a lot of this data collection and sample collection. She'll run to a specific amount of fields within each county, collect a specific amount of samples, and then count within those samples. So obviously there's fields that aren't being collected and there's fields that aren't being collected. And we know that a lot of these insects will be kind of spatially distributed differently depending on the topography of the county. So it gives producers an idea of risk in a region, but it's important for agronomists and producers to take that information and use it as ground proofing, scout, see what they're seeing in their ditches, in their fields, but it's certainly not the end all be all. And the important part to align that with is also the prairiepest.ca, the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network. They actually put out information in season that provides an idea of emergence and growth of some of these insects as well. What instar stage are they at? What to be looking for in the field. So when you align these risk maps, you can take that information as well as the progress and growth of these insects that's coming from prairiepest.ca and use that to scout and get an idea of what you're actually seeing in your fields, in your region, and make decisions from there. So it's an important distinction, Deb, that all of these, kind of large province-wide or Western Canada-wide risk maps, they provide an indicator for you to take and delve deeper into your region and get an idea of whether there's specific impact on your fields.
Mm-hmm. So, and I would say so, and we've had a few entomologists on the show that there are certain pests, of course, that we have maps for. There's certain diseases we have some forecast maps for. And I think it was when James Tansey was on, he had said, it does. This is why when the call goes out, do you have fields that you would let someone come scout or come take samples of or whatever? This is why it's so important that farmers or agronomists get people connected with those researchers, because the more data points we have, the better those maps are. But recognizing that sometimes those maps, might be extrapolated from only a few data points as opposed to as many as we'd love. So we definitely have just over the course of this year with this show, sometimes we take that forecast map and then we overlay what the actual season looks like. And sometimes they line up okay, sometimes not so much. So that's, a great question, Deb. It's fantastic. Kyler notes, in Ontario, we just have Pete giving alerts on Wednesdays. That's right. Pete's word comes out on Wednesdays. He will alert you potentially to a problem. I guess, Deb, that's a really good question for you. If you could choose a forecast map for an insect like that one, which one would you choose for Ontario? You have the power. You could make it happen.
I have
which
the
one
power.
would it be?
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, actually, for me, I want to say it's soybean aphids. soybean aphids are a chronic issue in my region. So we have them every year to some degree. Some years they blow up and other years they don't. So it would be really good to have a predictive model for that. I would jump all over that. But as far as one of the most challenging ones to scout for, it's spider mites. And man, if we could automate that, I would I would take that in a heartbeat, because they are hugely challenging to stay in front of, and very weather driven. So,
Right.
but yeah, aphids would be, I guess, first and foremost. And I
Okay.
mean, speaking of aphids, there were certainly hotspots in Ontario in 2022, and particularly Eastern Ontario, we had massive outbreaks and populations in soybeans for aphids. And I think most producers were spraying at least once, some twice. Hopefully not too many got into a third time. Having the right insecticide available in your region can sometimes be a problem when we have these mid-season outbreaks. We don't always have the right tool to be able to draw on. So that was a bit of a challenge for some producers as well to get their hands on the right insecticides, or they were sold out by that point in time. So, these supply chain issues keep bubbling up and handcuffing the agronomy side of the equation at times. But at the end of the day, I think producers that were on top of the sprays, on top of the populations, they were fairly satisfied with the outcome. And
Warren Steckenberger from out east says, he said, aphids 2 years in a row, Deb, you can take them back now.
Oh, okay.
So
we like to share.
Yeah, exactly. So please, please take those back. And Warren also notes it's too hot when scouting for spider mites.
Oh,
so
that's beach weather.
Yeah, exactly. That's what they like. So to me, that does speak to the importance of early scouting, knowing what you're looking for, knowing where to look for it, and then getting out there again and again and again. But yes, excellent point, Deb. If we could automate it in some way or get some predictability models that are functional, certainly would be a huge help. So if ag tech could get on that, that'd be great.
Yeah. It's interesting though. I mean, there are some farms in the area that will have aphids every year. And we know that. You get to know those farms. Those are the farms you go to look. Okay, is the spring population out and about? And go back 2 weeks later, have they moved on or are they building? And being able to find those locations in a region is pretty key to having a bit of a pulse on what the aphids are doing. The other challenge we ran into on a reasonably significant scale was aphids in cereals this year. And that's becoming more and more of an issue, particularly for our oat growers. Certainly the wheat had some. The spring cereals this year were loaded with them. The oats were loaded with them. You start talking 50 aphids per stem easily in the oat crop, and they seem to really flourish in the oat crop more than any other cereal, I would say. And they can cause a significant yield drag. So more and more producers are having to manage and monitor for oats and cereals here now as well. And I'm finding certainly in the last 5 years, we're using insecticide treatments in cereals more and more. The expectation for higher yields is there. They're getting paid for those higher yields rather well.
Right.
And we need to be on top of those. And that's becoming more and more of an issue.
So 2 things. We are talking cereal aphids and soybean aphids. They are both aphids, but different aphids.
Yep.
Different aphids completely. Yep.
Okay. One question before I go to Jason. Do you think having more oats as cover crops, so more oat acres in general, might be building populations?
That I don't have the answer to that. It could certainly be causing a bridge into the fall for that population. It's not uncommon. We actually plant winter wheat into those oat acres, from a rotational standpoint, and quite often we can see the aphid population then flourish onto the wheat fields. So it's quite possible that we're seeing that continuation happening in a worse way. Yep.
Okay. definitely something to keep tabs on. All right, Jason. So I heard you agreeing with Deb
Yeah.
on some of these. How similar then? We are going to talk about flea beetles. Don't worry, everybody. It's Manitoba. You can't not talk about flea beetles. I'm so sorry, Jason, but we really have to.
Yeah.
But let's talk aphids, cereal
Yeah.
aphids, these sorts of things as well. What did you see this year, or what are you seeing building?
Yeah, very similar to what Deb said. We saw a lot more aphids in cereals, like in spring wheat and oats. Primary one in oats is the bird cherry oat aphid, which is a vector for barley yellow dwarf. And so, to Deb's point, when you have that seeding a fall or winter cereal like winter wheat into an oat stubble, here it would be more common to possibly do fall rye. You're going to have that green bridge. And if you have that green bridge where that vector can get across, that's going to be a big issue. We also have the English grain aphid, which was more common in the wheat. So we did end up having that show up. So there's very, very similar in those cases. And, it's hard to predict them because some of them overwinter, some do not, like the bird cherry oat aphid and oats does not. So it has to blow up from the US, just like soybean aphid does. So it's a tough one to predict, and when it comes to soybean aphid, there is an alternate host here in Manitoba called buckthorn, which is also an alternate host for crown rust that affects oats.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really hard to know or hard to say whether or not, we're seeing any kind of overwintering populations, and that's why we're getting these populations established so soon. But I think right now we're thinking that it's mostly coming from the winds moving them up from the south.
Okay. Now, so now we have to talk about flea beetles. and Deb, this is one that I'm sure you've seen flea beetles. I'm sure they're around, but without a lot of canola acres, I don't know that they're a huge issue. But in the West, of course, they are just, oh my gosh. So Jeremy, I know you're a wheat and barley guy, but you're still going to have to talk about flea beetles at some point. But Jason, I'll start with you. Just how bad was it? And are we in a complete pickle with this pest? Because I feel like we are. That's only getting worse.
Yeah, apocalyptic is what I think comes to mind.
Cool.
Every year, it just seemed to be there every year. It doesn't seem to matter. Like, So yeah, you see those photos there. So to the one on the left that shows the canola to flea beetles, I could show you pictures where there's probably like a dozen or more on one plant. But it was just how quickly they progressed the field from almost no issues to beyond 25% defoliation. So we seem to have them every year. It's hard to say whether or not the populations are shifting more from crucifer to stripe or vice versa. But I mean, we're really starting to look at needing to focus on that later seeding that I talked about before, about putting soybeans first, then canola later, to try to delay and get past that, the peak of the population, but also, looking at these other insecticides like the Buteo Start that we had on the decal canola varieties did help. In a lot of cases, when the pressure was really high, we still had to spray those fields, but it gave us probably 4 days to as much as maybe a week before we had to spray them versus the other untreated acres. But when we sprayed them, we only had to spray them once. So there is some benefit to it, but again, it's not a, it's another Band-Aid. Is kind of how we look at it, but it gives us a little bit more more options or a little bit more time to make those decisions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this question always comes up. So Michael, thank you for asking it. In the fall, often you're swathing canola or you're harvesting, and the ground is just covered in flea beetles. Does the fall population that you see actually inform the next year's pressure?
According to our professional entomologists within the province, the answer is no. There's been research that shows that there isn't an exact correlation, but we do see, we do still see the trends. where populations are high in the fall, we have them in the spring. But there is no correlation that you can take that as a guarantee. A lot of it will come back to the kind of winter we have. But I mean, we've had winters where we've had almost no snow, and yet they make it through the winter in shelter belts and tree rows, under leaf litter, and they seem to still manage to survive. So I think, I mean, they're always going to be there. It's just a matter of fact. But at least the most recent research doesn't show that there's an exact correlation.
Mm-hmm. No, as far as I understand it, I have heard the same. We are going to do more on the flea beetle problem in the new year for sure. Probably early February, we're going to devote an entire show to it. So don't worry, Jeremy, you're off the hook on that one. But I do want to quickly, because of course Manitoba has struggled, Saskatchewan in parts has struggled. Of course, yes, you're the wheat and barley specialist, so I'm not going to ask you to offer agronomic advice on flea beetles. But with the farmers you talk to, is this an increasing concern in some areas or not as much as some of the others?
Yeah, I have. There's no doubt. I mean, we've seen the issue increasing in Alberta. More of a conversation, more challenges, more question about spraying. More issues around potential reseeding, and what Jason's talked about here is, we've hit this kind of perfect storm of flea beetles. And again, I am certainly not a canola expert, nor am I an entomologist, but we're growing longer season varieties, so we're seeding earlier. So those late seeded, acres, as Jason had mentioned, are kind of avoiding some of that those stresses. The value of canola is quite high, so potentially there's some shorter rotation issues in there. Based on the entomologists, the conversations I've had in Alberta, there is a shift towards that striped flea beetle, which is causing more issues. And then, my goodness, it feels like every year spring is bringing challenges of how quickly that crop can get out of the ground. So it's just environmental conditions are causing canola to drag its ass, so to speak. Excuse my language. I mean, we get frost, we get dry conditions, we get excess moisture, and it's just making the situation worse, so the flea beetles can continue to feed and add more stress to that canola. And it almost feels like the first 3 weeks of canola emergence last 2 years, and then finally we escape, right? It's just every year, it's a huge conversation, and it seems to be getting worse. And I don't know what the resolution to it is at this point. Obviously, there's a lot to be understood, and I think we need to get a better understanding of what we can do to mitigate this, short of having to spray every.
Yeah. And also just be really glad that you're a wheat and barley specialist, and so really it's not your problem.
And that's the challenge. We spray we spray so much, it's not sustainable. I mean,
no.
What we saw this year here in Manitoba, and again, this is just me thinking out loud anecdotally, but when soybean aphid started to really ramp up, I had no beneficials, like zero, nothing. No flea, no ladybugs, no hoverfly larvae, no lacewing larvae, nothing. And eventually their populations did build again. But what I'm wondering is, we're destroying all these beneficials when we're out there spraying for these flea beetles time and time again. And now we're going to lose another active for controlling them. So we need something better. We can't just keep doing this.
Yep, absolutely.
Well,
all right.
And
go ahead, Deb.
For what it's worth, I realize canola is a microcrop in Ontario relative to the guys out west, but we had similar issues, and we literally changed how we planted canola. We moved to planting at the end of May and completely changed. That was the only thing that was going to address the issue. It was flea beetles and it was swede midge. So by moving initially it was cabbage seed pod weevil. So moving the flowering dates and moving the emergence dates changed the entire dynamic. Of course, then swede midge came along and we had to move it back, but we broke the cycle, and that was enough to change things and reset the clock a bit. But
And I'm not.
That's okay when you're not on huge acres.
Yeah, but no, you're right, Deb, and I'm not afraid to put canola later. I mean, the,
No.
the thing is, in the past, it's been, well, you can't see canola late because it's going to flower when it's the hottest part of the summer, and yeah, that's still the case. But our hybrids can tolerate the stress of higher heat way better now than they did 15 or 20 years ago. And as long as there's moisture around those roots, I think they can tolerate that much more to kind of put up with that. So I think the trade-off with seeding later is still better than, putting up with having delayed emergence because it's too cold, or having frost, or having flea beetle issues.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Well, plant some winter canola.
Yeah.
Get some winter canola going.
Yeah.
Mercedes, right? Is that the one?
Yeah,
Mercedes.
that's the one.
That's the one. Everybody, what variety are you going to plant? One variety. Okay, all right. We need to. We're going to send one last shout out to our show sponsors, and then we're going to switch gears and spend the last little bit here talking about diseases of the year. Tonight's episode is brought to you by ADAMA Canada, CanolaMaster, and RealAg Radio. RealAg Radio is Canada's only 1-hour agricultural radio show, broadcasting daily at 4:30 Eastern on Rural Radio 147 on Sirius XM. Join host Sean Haney as he speaks to a wide variety of guests about agronomy, current events, politics, and much more. Can't listen live? Visit realagradio.com, download the podcast, or call our listener line at 888-746-3311. Alrighty, okay. We are in the home stretch for the year, for the show, for it all, and all the marbles. Kyler, excellent point. My 40-acre winter canola experiment is 0.001% of the crop in Ontario, and it's been a blast, he says. So there you go, making a difference 40 acres at a time. All right, definitely, I think on this topic, as I said, we're going to tackle it in February for sure, but I definitely see some research projects coming up, and definitely some farmers trying some new things in 2023, I would say. Let's switch gears. Let's talk diseases. If there's anyone who really wants to go first, but barring that, I'm gonna go Jeremy. I'm gonna go west to east. Jeremy, biggest disease.
It's because you
story.
love. It's because you love wheat, isn't it?
Know what? Canola's had its day.
Soybeans. You can't have wheat, so
That's right. Yeah.
Boychyn,
Barley. Here we go.
Interestingly, in Alberta and parts of Saskatchewan, we didn't really see a lot of issues on wheat and barley any worse than any typical year, right? Like we had a decent amount of moisture in June, which brought out our normal foliar diseases in wheat and barley, but nothing excessive, nothing that we were getting, calls about and issues. And then interestingly, once we got into July and August, the taps shut off. So the next question was, is fusarium going to be an issue? Well, we didn't have the moisture, we didn't have the humidity, so fusarium head blight, we kind of jumped over that being a significant province-wide issue. There's certainly areas where it did pop up, and producers are seeing that in their green quality reports, but those normal diseases that we deal with, there was no massive outbreaks that we saw that would cause any more than typical issues that you would be looking to control. The one disease we are seeing more and more pop up, specifically in the southern part of the province under irrigation, is bacterial leaf streak. So this is a viral bacteria that doesn't respond the same way as a fungus. So identification of this disease is going to be so important. And I wish I had shared a picture of this. I didn't know we'd be talking about it, but this is growing in oats and barley, and in some cases wheat, where it's really passed through the seed. It can live in the soil and in residue, but the major movement of that virus is through the seed. So you plant a crop, it gets infected, you don't know that it's infected, you take that seed and you use it for your crop next year. Well, you have that infection in your new crop. And there is no control mechanism in crop. Fungicides won't work. So the best way to mitigate impact is to stop using that seed source. The problem is there's very few options right now for testing whether seed is infected. We can test whether the plant material is infected through bacterial streaming. But knowing that whether the seed lot's infected or not, I think 2020 Seed Labs has a test now available. But the problem with that is okay, well, what level infection requires changing to a new seed lot? What level of infection may cause a certain percentage of impact on that crop? And that's going to be really determinant of the environmental conditions that you deal with in a year. So maybe if you're under irrigation, you're assuming you're going to have more moisture, more infection. Moving to a seed lot, if you have any level of infection, may be the smarter move. We still don't know. But if you're in dry land, spending money on a new seed lot, if you don't know whether you're going to get moisture, if in the special areas, that's a hard decision to make, right? So this is one disease that we're looking to get more information on. Mike Harding, who works with Alberta Agriculture, is putting out a lot of information on it and talking about it. And there's some research that's been invested in it right now to get an idea of, is there specific varieties that may be more tolerant? What kind of control mechanisms can we have? But, this is one thing that, although is in a small portion of fields right now, can become quite a significant issue if it continues to move through seed lots and grow within the industry. So it's something for producers and agronomists to be very knowledgeable on, because if your field becomes infected with bacterial leaf streak, and the assumption is that it is a fungal disease and you go through and spray, well, you're probably just traipsing some of that virus bacteria through your crop, increasing infection, adding moisture to the field, causing damage, which is spreading it from one plant to the other. So in some situations, it may be best to not spray if you're just dealing with bacterial leaf streak, but typically that's not the scenario that we're dealing with. If there's enough moisture for bacterial leaf streak, there's typically enough moisture for your other fungal diseases. So you're going through to control your fungal diseases, but you're traipsing and spreading your bacterial disease. So it's really just kind of a challenging mess right now that we're trying to get a better idea of what options there are for farmers, and what control mechanisms can be put in place. But the main thing right now is to be knowledgeable about what it looks like. And if you do have infection, look at options for changing seed lots.
You mentioned the special areas. If nobody knows what that is, they are definitely special. Google it. Okay. I promised west to east. So Jason, you're up next. Biggest disease challenge of 2022.
Blackleg and verticillium stripe, I would have to say. It was amazing how wet we were, and yet I've got fields of canola we never sprayed for sclerotinia, and there was no yield impact. And we didn't even see any issues with fusarium as well. And I think a lot of it had to do with that whole disease triangle. We didn't have the pathogen. We had the host, the plant, we had the environment, but we didn't have the pathogen, or didn't have it at the right time. And a lot of it, when it comes back to the fusarium as well as the sclerotinia, over the last 3 years prior, we've been dry. And so I think the sclerotia, or the actual pathogen, what we've been returning back into the soil, has been lower every time. And so I think there was just that much less pressure on it. But at the same time, other diseases that are creeping up more, like blackleg and especially verticillium, really showed strongly this year. And it's interesting because it is, again, the verticillium stripe in particular shows up later in the season. It's soil borne and generally likes that hot, dry environment. And we didn't have that. And yet it really made an impact, especially going from, western Manitoba, the escarpment was the worst. And then going east, it was less. But it's starting to have a big yield impact. So those are the main two that I would say.
Mm-hmm. And both blackleg and verticillium, of course, infect very early, but the impacts show up far later. So
Correct.
far less visual than, say, Sclerotinia. All right. We are running
Correct.
short on time. Deb, biggest disease story, totally tar spot, right? It was everywhere. It was terrible. No.
Oh, no, it was overblown.
Right.
So, but in all fairness, 2021 was its sort of big establishment and growth year in Ontario. Moved halfway across the province, significant yield reductions, high levels of infection. Um, and the thought would be that we would see an increased amount of infection going into 2022. But of course, like Jason said, that disease triangle didn't back it up, didn't support it. By the time we got into that critical infection window in July, it was dry. We didn't have a lot of leaf wetness. We didn't have a lot of additional rainfall and consistent leaf moisture. So we didn't see the infection rate set up hardly at all. There was definitely some identification of tar spot in the southern areas of the province, but a handful of research sites where they had, some measurable yield differences, treated versus untreated. But fortunately, a non-issue. We didn't come across it at all in the 2022 season. So every year's different. We know the inoculums here. We know the surrounding states have issues. I'm really looking forward to having hybrid differentiation information when it comes to tar spot. I think that really is where our management should start. No different than when we're looking at fusarium and wheat. Pick a right variety that has some tolerance there. And if we can get that genetic information of which hybrids have some tolerance to tar spot, that'll make a huge difference for producers of whether they need to treat or not treat. And then, of course, we're all agronomists on here. We got to scout the fields. And by the time, if you're relying on imagery or any other tech tool to tell you when or if you have tar spot, you've missed the boat. So boots on the ground thing is absolutely critical for diagnosing and monitoring those sorts of things like tar spot. And then, I guess the rest of the picture on diseases was fairly non-eventful here in Ontario. We had, going along with that moderate rainfall scenario, we didn't see a lot of white mold in beans. We didn't see a lot of white mold in canola. Eastern Ontario had the most consistent rainfall, and no doubt they were treating for white mold out there, but pretty uneventful. What did show up more so in corn this year was northern corn leaf blight. So even though the environment wasn't 100% right for tar spot, it was certainly there for northern corn leaf blight. And so, we can't just get the blinders on thinking we're looking for the latest and greatest bad one.
Right.
All those other ones still lurk in the background and surely showed up this year.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Deb, that, it's important to be prepared for what's ahead or a new emerging disease or those sorts of things. But we still have to recognize, what's endemic already and potentially a threat every year after year. And we know it's there. So, now we are about out of time, but we really haven't talked about weeds. So, again, January, I think the third week of January, we'll be talking about herbicide resistant weeds on the program. So be sure to check that out. But this time I'll go east to west and we'll try and do this quickly. But Deb, biggest or most emergent weed problem for your clientele this year?
Water hemp. Actually, I'm going to say for Ontario, it's water hemp. I have one known case of it. So we're fairly fortunate in this region to be avoiding it for whatever reason. I think there's a variety of reasons, very intentional, but we're fairly good in that way. But it's a problem. It's a huge problem, and trying to have the right strategies in place is constantly a moving target. And residual weed control it's an absolute must. And some of these biotech solutions, aren't always it's not a one trick pony here. We have to have multiple solutions going into water. And And the number one solution that gets ignored, not ignored, I shouldn't say that, but forgotten, not implemented enough, is crop rotation. Crop rotation, crop rotation.
Mm-hmm.
Breaking cycles is step number one to either avoiding resistance or helping to minimize resistance issues. And it's good for a whole lot of other reasons as well, but dodging resistance is certainly up there as well.
Mm-hmm. I will say when crop prices are pretty decent across the board, you don't have a lot of good reasons not to be doing good rotation. So
Exactly.
I'll leave it at that. All right, Jason, as promised,
Yep.
going east to west. Your eyes lit up at water hemp, but in a bad way.
Yeah.
How's the Palmer Amaranth and water hemp
Well,
doing in Manitoba?
well, Jay, you want to throw up those pictures that I sent you under the increasing weed resistant and noxious weed title? Throw those up there. So I'll start with the Palmer. Last year, our agronomist, Carly Owen, found the very first confirmed water hemp, or excuse me, Palmer plant in the country. And so this year, of course, she's very diligent in scouting. And so the bottom right two photos that you see there are Palmer that she found this year in a sunflower field. So the second confirmed. So we've got it now. And then those other photos those top three are water hemp. And so we're seeing a lot more of it now and in areas where we haven't found it before. So it's becoming a bigger issue. And of course, we are very concerned on the Palmer side. But the two photos in the bottom left that you see there is Deb's favorite, Canada fleabane. And this is not something that's talked about a lot, but you should see the fleabane out here now. It is unreal. Those photos I showed you there, that's the same field. Those are plants side by side, sprayed with 1 liter of a 540 glyphosate. And they were small and sprayed. I think we have an emerging issue with fleabane spreading across the bigger part of our area from the sandy soils to the west into the clay. But I think what we're seeing is because of how far that seed can travel, we're getting a resistance. What I'm suspecting is resistance being brought up here.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Isn't it fun not to have to talk about kochia the whole time? Just kidding. This is terrifying. And given that those plants are side by side, it is increasingly terrifying.
Oh, yeah.
So absolutely, Jason, this is it's an excellent red flag and something that we're going to set some time aside, definitely in the winter months leading up to the spring, to talk about more. Jeremy, are you thankful not to have any of those? You just have,
I mean, I did have
atrocious other ones, but
I did have some good answers, but now my biggest concern is Ontario and Manitoba keeping their weeds to themselves, it seems.
That's legit. Yeah.
This year, if you drove through southern Alberta, and I'm sure southern Saskatchewan, you're asking yourself, geez, did kochia take over? The drought conditions that we had this year and last year early on really allowed kochia to flourish, and I'm sure there's some other factors in there as well, but it was everywhere this year, and it's likely going to continue to be an issue next year with all of those seeds out. So, in short, kochia continues to be a growing issue with resistant concerns, and not a lot of strong management practices that can be implemented to really slow it down. Wild oats continues to grow as a concern. We're seeing resistance pop up, group 1 and 2, in areas that there was good proper rotation of herbicide groups and proper layering, and unsure where they're coming from. So, producers who see these weeds pop up and wondering what's going on, was my timing off? do the safe thing and get it tested, because managing those patches and managing those resistant weeds early is what's going to stop them from being a massive issue. On top of that, proper rotation aspect, rotate your groups, layer your groups, but test to see what you're dealing with so you can manage it appropriately. This year, in terms of timing of application, we had some challenges as well. The dry early spring slowed crops, but it also slowed the weeds. And then we got into excess moisture in some areas, which push those weeds, change the timing of some herbicide applications. There was some last minute decisions on which herbicides need to be applied, which would actually control the weeds that were popping up, because the weed profile changed, because the environmental condition changed. And then in the year that we were in which finding some products was already a challenge, sourcing the correct chemicals became a little bit of a game for some producers. So between those three things, on top of the pests and the disease, we certainly had our hands full in Western Canada in terms of managing stress and managing pests.
Absolutely. I've also, so one of the things, of course, leading into 2022, we talked a lot about potential shortages of different products, or just logistics issues of getting them into the right places, which, certainly hearing evidence of that here tonight. I'm hopeful maybe next year some of these have resolved. Thanks, Deb. I said I was hopeful, and now you're crushing my dream.
Yeah, it's a different list,
okay.
But there's still a list.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So, definitely one of the other things, to keep in mind, and Deb, as you alluded to it, is if you have a better handle on what you might need, there might be a chance of getting into location on time, but we probably are not in a, I need it, do you have it? Yes, we do. And of course, then in the West, we're also dealing with a product being removed from shelves for an insecticide pass as well. So,
is that not a problem here as well?
So, I'll ask you, Deb. It is, in that, as far as I understand it, the biggest one would be alfalfa. For any of the lambda psi, you couldn't feed your alfalfa to livestock if you use it. It could only be used for seed production. So that's even just one crop, let alone
we use it on wheat, we use it on canola, we use it on potatoes. Potatoes go into livestock feed.
Yeah. So, and this is a serious issue. So, so for anyone who's looking for more wheat, the latest we have is that it is not available for 2023. For sure not in the West, likely not in Ontario, but it may be back for 2024, but we're going to have to keep tabs on that. This is a big one. All right, we are out of time. And actually, I think we are at a hard stop at 9:15. So Jay is very soon just going to cut the feed and I'll be done. So wonderful evening. Thank you all for sharing your time with me, especially this time of year. It is very busy. I am looking forward to getting back at this. Of course, January 9th, we'll be back. But Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me tonight and several times over this year. I do appreciate it. And you're welcome. We will keep our weeds to ourselves. And Deb Campbell, thank you as well for sharing your insight. And yes, enjoy the balmy weather compared to your friends here on the screen. And Jason, yes, thank you for your avatar of a snowman. Absolutely.
Merry Christmas, you guys, and Happy New Year.
Yeah,
Merry
there we
Christmas,
go.
everybody.
All right. Yes, it's finally starting to feel like it, because now we have snow. All right. And of course, on behalf of the Real Agriculture team, we do say thank you for joining us for this whole show this year. I think we're into the 90s now. Excuse me, is how many shows we've done, which is pretty exciting. So thank you to all our guests, and of course all our commenters and our viewers that keep the show running and exciting. Monday nights are my favorite, and I do adore the show. Thanks, of course, to our show sponsors, to ADAMA Canada, to CanolaMaster, and to RealAg Radio. And on behalf of producer Jay Stroeve and myself, thank you all. Have a very Merry Christmas, and we'll see you January 9th in the new year. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.